The opening scene could be introduced with a single elongated note, from a cello, for example. It could be bassy, deep, ominous. The whole piece should be mid-tempo, feel bright and jolly, warm and not intrusive. An accordion could be used to complement the French feel. Avoid obvious cliches. Hi, my name's Vince. I work as a composer. And today I thought I'd spend a little bit of time thinking about the topic of composing briefs. In this video I specifically want to talk about the issue of creative engagement and the issue of how to read the brief imaginatively so that you get a sense of what the client's after and you're able to take on board some very specific information while not getting too bogged down in the creative process. One of my favourite quotes, it got thrown around quite a lot while I was at music college, and it's this phrase, "Writing about music is like dancing about architecture." And I think that's really true, that when it comes to trying to put into words what it is that a client is looking for in a piece of music, it can be really difficult, and there are various pitfalls that people fall into. So off the top of my head, I came up with about 5 different tropes when it comes to compositional briefs, and different approaches that I take when trying to make sense of them. And these are the bog standard, the instant classic, the oxymoron, the musician, and finally the DIY. Whether you're a composer already or whether this is just something that you're interested in learning more about, hopefully there'll be something interesting in here. So for a bit of context, I've been writing music professionally for about the last 10 years full-time, and I've been doing it part-time before that. I started doing small compositional briefs while I was at university in London, and then I'd graduated to doing slightly meatier projects after that. I started out doing music for apps and small mobile games, and then I moved into production music or library music. After that, I had some opportunities to work on TV ad pitches, and so that's also a regular feature of my work these days, writing music for TV advertising. I've worked on a handful of short film projects and animations, and then more recently I've had the opportunity to work on larger scale video game projects which have a bit more scope. And so we'll be touching on those different mediums as we talk about briefs, but primarily I'm talking about any context where a client is coming to me with a vision and the brief is just the first step towards defining what it is they're looking for, and then from that point there'll be various rounds of feedback as we slowly hone in on the idea and just firm it up. Sometimes the brief will just be an email with a paragraph describing roughly what the client's after. Other times it'll be a more neatly formatted PDF with the word brief at the top. But on the whole, briefs generally contain information like the duration of the track that they're looking for, or the number of tracks if it's a larger project, the kind of instrumentation that they're looking for, or a reference to a genre. Very often it will contain links to external pieces of music or existing films, things on YouTube, to use as reference points. And the brief will also be involved in telling a bit of the story behind the project. What's happening emotionally, what are the intention of the drama, or what are the brand values if it's a commercial piece, that kind of thing. So the first kind of brief I've termed the bog standard. And what I mean by that is that there's a very, very clear direction set by the brief. It's in a pre-existing genre of some kind, for example, epic orchestral music. The brief might reference Hans Zimmer. There might be links to pre-existing trailer music, pre-existing production music albums, and essentially the vibe of the brief is we're not actually looking for anything that new, we're just wanting kind of more of the same in this style. And I guess the challenge with this kind of brief is, where do I fit in? Where does my taste come into it? How do I remain excited about this brief? Well, particularly if the project is something like a production music album, where you're not being asked necessarily to hit any particular hit points within a piece of film, or you're not having to accent any particular dramatic themes or characters. You're simply being asked to create music which, for want of a better term, is a bit generic. It might sound a bit strange to be starting with this kind of generic music brief, but in reality, quite a large part of my bread and butter work has to do with servicing these kinds of jobs. And it's actually not to do with so much asserting your own individual voice as a composer, but it's about producing high-quality work that fits within a certain pre-existing trope and uses a certain vocabulary that's already been established in the medium, whether it's the medium of TV or promo or corporate video. There's a whole kind of cloud of associations that exist with this particular music trope. The minute you hear it, it kind of reminds you of many other things that you've heard. And from a branding perspective, but also just from a storytelling perspective, that can be an incredibly effective shortcut to tapping into an emotional core in the listener. When I was starting out, I was very concerned with the idea of selling out, or the idea of not having an original voice, not having something unique to say. But in many cases, there just isn't the time to really communicate very much to the listener, because you've only got 30 seconds to work with, for example, in the case of a TV ad. And so you want to hit them with something that the listener can grab onto immediately. And so rather than kind of fighting this sense of being trapped in a box of a genre, I've learned to kind of embrace it. And that doesn't mean to just sort of give up doing anything new, but rather I find the challenge is then to discover it afresh. And so often what I'll do is I'll go listen to lots of music in this style. Usually I'll try and do this as a separate stage to the composing, because I don't like to have other people's music in my head when I'm sitting down trying to write. But I'll spend maybe an afternoon just listening to lots of music in this style and really trying to pay attention and find things that I appreciate and things that I like, and just kind of sit there with an open mind, and not be dismissive of anything just because it fits into a trope, but to appreciate the craftsmanship that is present, to appreciate the structural elements that are present, and just kind of notice the fact that actually that stuff is really effective, and it would be great if I could produce something that was that effective. And then the more I listen, the more I notice there's lots of things there which would actually challenge me. There are certain instrumentation or orchestration or harmony techniques where I can at least appreciate a particular aspect of it that can inspire me and make me feel like new creation and new creativity is possible within that genre. The word that comes to mind is sincerity. For me, I can't really continue or progress with a piece unless at some level I'm kind of nodding my head as I'm writing it and kind of enjoying it, and I can feel it sort of moving me emotionally. If I feel like I'm going through the motions or just kind of ironically referencing parts of a genre but in a slightly kind of snide or distanced or ironic way, that to me feels like a bit of a problem. I think maybe the challenge of these kinds of briefs is to just really feel them, even though there's a sense that this is a well-trodden path. The second kind of brief I'm calling the instant classic. This is where the client has this idea that they want something really cool, really iconic. Oftentimes they've explored the possibility of licensing a really classic piece of pop music, but either they can't afford it or their application was rejected by the record label, and so they've got it in their head that they want something that is just instantly recognizable, has this great hook, people are going to remember it, they're going to have this like big rush of emotions associated with it, which is all the things that could happen if they had licensed that great pop track. It can't sound like the pop tune at all because they've already approached the brand, and if they do a sound alike, it's going to be really obvious. They don't want to get into a lawsuit, so we don't want that. We don't want it to sound like the track, but we want it to be really kind of iconic. So obviously the big problem here is that it's impossible. The music isn't just in the notes, it's in the space between the notes, it's in the context, it's in the personality of the singer, it's in the car journey that you took with the roof down singing the song with your friends on a summer holiday, it's in the big stadium gig that you experienced, or the music video, or the aesthetic. It's in what you know about the life story of the singer. It's that whole kind of network of associations. So of course nothing that you create is ever going to quite match up to that. It's likely that the client will recognize all of this at some level, and so my job in this situation is generally to push back a little bit if possible, create a bit of breathing room, and try and just open a few more doors with regards to different ways I could go down musically. At the end of the day, it's about creating something that's effective, something that works, and that's my number one priority, and it's also the number one priority of the client. We've got that in common. So actually, rather than trying to do a weak copy of some pre-existing pop song while avoiding a copyright lawsuit at the same time, I'll generally try and go down a completely different angle. When I was starting out, I was actually quite bad at voicing these kinds of thoughts, and so I would just feel a bit kind of boxed in and trapped in a corner, sort of produce something that perhaps wasn't very good, and just sort of turn it in and create a bit of a bad impression, probably, in retrospect. Whereas now I feel a lot more confident about speaking my mind about what I think will and won't work, and sort of trusting my intuitions. It sounds really obvious, but in this situation, it's best not to get too kind of blown off course by a really particular brief, but look at the picture, look at the vibe, look at the aesthetic, look at the values, look at the story, and then just kind of do my ordinary thing of just hearing what kind of music would fit. And often it's far better to go in with a strong track that's a bit off brief, or just way off brief, if you can get away with it, than a weak track that sort of hits the points but isn't a very good piece of music at the end of the day. The next style of brief I'm calling the oxymoron, because it contains multiple instructions which conflict with one another. One of the most common examples of this is where clients are very prescriptive about all the hit points that they want to get, maybe with very specific instructions about stopping the tempo or bringing out the drums or whatever. But at the same time, they'll say, we want the music to kind of just help gel everything together. We don't want it to feel fragmented. And so here we've got a situation where on the one hand, we're trying to do all of this stuff with the music. On the other hand, we're just trying to make a track. Another variant of the oxymoron brief would be where there are multiple genres kind of mashed up into a single brief. So we want to start off with a kind of salsa feel, and then something happens which requires some more of an orchestral vibe. And then towards the end, we want to go into kind of like an epic action trailer with some light kind of flourishes to highlight certain comedic moments. And of course, we don't want it to sound like a complete mess, and we don't want it to sound like it's multiple pieces of music. Another situation I sometimes find myself in is where there are lyrics provided, which have been written with basically no musical consideration, or they've worked on a previous piece of music that was very different, and now there's a new music brief in a completely different feel, but we've got the old lyrics. So as you can tell, I'm using this as a bit of a catch-all category for sort of impossible instructions. And again, the situation here is just to be kind of bold and open and voice your thoughts at the start of the process, and not to feel too bad about prioritizing. The degree to which I'll share the fact that I'm ignoring strategically certain parts of the brief before handing it in really varies. Sometimes I'll discuss more or less exactly what I'm going to do or what I'm going to attempt. But even then, I'll often say, well, it's going to be a case of getting my hands dirty and seeing what works, because it always is. Other times I will just go with my best instincts and drop certain parts of the brief as I'm going, if I have a clear sense of which parts are most important based on what's working. Particularly when I'm pitching and I know the client's going to have multiple options, I'll always go with creating a stronger track that doesn't quite fit the brief versus one that fulfills all the criteria. The brief is often only used as a starting point or to give ideas, and often it can be deceptive even when there are very strong kinds of terminology in the brief. It should do this, it should do that. Often the actual expectation behind that document is, this is just a place to get some ideas down on the page, and then we'll take it from there. And so it's always going to be a bit of a negotiation. The next type of brief I wanted to talk about, I'm terming the musician. The musician is the brief which is often a very long brief, sometimes several pages, sometimes a whole essay, which is a kind of blow-by-blow account of how the music needs to work. Specifically talking about notation, chords even. Sometimes I have a client actually sing something down the phone to me. And so in those situations, I think it's about embracing the sort of active spirit of the client in that situation, the fact that they're trying to really communicate something very specific, but also maintaining a kind of distance. After all, you are being asked to provide your own creative input. The way that I generally respond to this kind of brief is one of polite interest and also a kind of receptivity, because oftentimes, especially in the feedback rounds, I receive very particular musical instruction that turns out to be really good. However, there are times when it can be quite annoying, and so then the challenge is to try and see past the technical descriptions of the music. Often I'll try and steer the conversation away from specific musical direction and more towards other kinds of analogies, so that I can maybe make my own connections and my own associations. Ultimately, if I'm trying to satisfy certain harmonic or rhythmic criteria that are coming from some other place, rather than arriving as a result of me ingesting the information about the story, then it can feel a bit arbitrary. It can sometimes water down the music a little bit. So I think it's really about seeing the music behind the music that's being described, as opposed to taking things too literally in that kind of situation. Finally, we have the DIY brief, and this is where the client is quite scant on information. They don't really give you a lot of direction. Maybe this is because they just trust you and they've worked with you on something else before. Maybe they just have music quite low on their agenda and they know they need something, but they don't really mind what it is too much, or they're not too focused on it. Or perhaps more likely they're just looking for somebody to give them a bit of help, a bit of creative direction. Definitely the biggest pitfall that I find when working with no brief or with a kind of lightly defined brief is just the risk of things being a bit of a hodgepodge. So I might start off with something quite orchestral, and then I just fancy kind of putting a few synthy things in there, and maybe I add a beat. And then if it's a larger project with multiple tracks, the tracks don't really sound consistent with one another. And then the other thing that can happen is that because I'm sort of awash in a sea of possibility a little bit, I might sort of slip into kind of familiar tropes and patterns without really thinking about it. I might end up taking fewer risks. And I think this is often the case when I just rush straight into writing and I just kind of go with the flow. Usually it's better, I find, to do that a little bit and kind of find my feet, but then to take a step back and actually take some notes, gather some reference tracks, write a bit about my thoughts, write about things that inspire me, actually ponder maybe on recording projects and sound worlds and things that interest me, and wondering whether any of those might fit. You know, I've always wanted to work with a choir. Maybe this project, would this be a good fit with a choir? Sort of embracing external limitations, such as pre-existing groups or collaborators that you might have access to. I think now, for a variety of reasons, I've gotten more comfortable with my own personal taste and perhaps gotten a little bit more confident in my intuitions about what constitutes good music for me. And so that task of finding the right sort of rules to the game, sort of making my own game, feels a little bit less daunting. I'm very aware that what excites me most when I'm writing, and just generally, is this feeling of having a foot out in the unknown. And so I'm aware that the best way often to proceed if there's no brief is to find something that I can't quite do yet that's drawing me outside of my comfort zone, creating some kind of game to play where I'm being constantly pulled away from my familiar patterns and tricks is just a really good thing for my writing and generally. So there are some very general thoughts about briefs, particularly challenging briefs, and how I approach writing music in those situations. I think the main thing that I've learned is just to treat it all as good information. Even if I don't end up following those instructions exactly, the instructions can provide a sketch of the sort of atmosphere they're looking to create, and so my job after all is to make the musical judgment calls and decisions. Those are kind of my puzzles to solve. In my experience, clients have always been very open to tweaking the brief based on things that I might comment on or might flag up. I think finding that right balance of knowing when to hold your ground and at the same time being genuinely receptive and also not snobbish towards any particular ideas that may come up, because who knows, they might be good ideas. So yeah, stay calm, stay peaceful, don't be perturbed by language that puts you off. If you're in a musical profession, it probably means that you've got a creative mind, an open mind, and you're good at kind of spotting patterns. Try and understand what they're really saying, even if the words are saying one thing. What is the meaning behind the meaning? And of course, if the brief kind of rubs you the wrong way, if you don't connect with the story, or you feel like the job's just going to be way too much hassle because of something that you're picking up in the way that the client communicates, then you're obviously under no obligation to take the job. You can just say no. And that's something that it took me quite a few years to realise, that it's possible to just turn down projects and not be too afraid that nobody's ever going to ask you back again. If you'd like to learn more about the creative production side of how I go about briefs, and also some examples of some feedback and back and forth, then you can check out this video here where I talk about a TV advertising project I worked on for the UK supermarket Asda. Good luck with all of your composition briefs. I hope there was a little nugget of useful information in here somewhere, and do let me know your experience in the comments. But all that remains to say is thank you very much for watching, and see you on the next video.